thank you all for coming out today. And Tom, thank you so much for the introduction. We know that there's a lot of programming happening today, and we're so pleased that you made time and effort to stop in for this event. I want to start by thanking the Department of American Studies, the School of Arts and Sciences, and Zimmerly for co-sponsoring this event, and a special thanks to Donna Gustafson. It's been great to collaborate with you over the years, and I look forward to future collaborations. Donna's awesome, we all know that. Also, thank you to Rebecca Renowitz for all her help with organizing, and Tom, again, thank you for welcoming us and hosting this event. My role in Aperture's Prison Nation is as a guest contributing editor. And I came to this role through initial conversations with Brendan Wattenberg, the managing editor, and also our panelist tonight, and Michael Famigetti, who is the editor of Aperture, that led to an ongoing collaboration, not only with the amazing special issue that we will be selling after our panel, but also a series of public programs and an exhibition that was housed in the gallery at Aperture, but will be traveling throughout the country, hopefully over the next couple of years. And it's based in research I've been doing for the past several years on the visual culture of mass incarceration. Through that research, I've come to know a lot of amazing artists and activists, and I have to say, I'm a super fangirl today of every single person on this panel. I'm really excited to have, this is my dream team of panelists, so this is a really great event for me. And I hope that you are as enthused as I am. What I do want to say is that Brendan is going to talk about the content of this special issue. What I want to say is what I hope people take away from it. And we're at a moment where mass incarceration is somewhat of a buzzword. Prison reforms is also somewhat of a buzzword. But we haven't seen really substantive change in the carceral state. We're actually at a moment where we have a re-articulation of mass detention and mass incarceration. And we're, through nativist ideologies and current policies, we're actually incarcerating more and more people in detention centers and black sites. And I hope that this magazine, and I hope that the conversation we're having today will be a part of an ongoing conversation about about how we come together and really reimagine our justice system, how we come up with ideas of transformative justice, and how we create the broadest notions of freedom for the broadest spectrum of people. And with that said, I want to introduce our moderator, Che Gossett. Che is a Black trans film writer and archivist at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, as well as a graduate student here at Rutgers in Transgender Studies. They have written for Verso Press Blog, the LA Review of Books, and most recently contributed to the anthology Trapdoor, Transcultural Production, and the Politics of Transvisibility, which came out just this year with MIT Press and was edited by Raina Gossett, Joanna Burton, and Eric Stanley. They are also a 2017-2018 Palestine American Research Center Fellow and a 2017-2018 New York Queer Arts Mentor. Che will introduce each panelist before our panelist speaks. Each panelist will present for about 10 to 12 minutes, but I think at this time we want to bring everyone up and we'll have Che take over. Thank you.
So first I want to say thank you to Nicole, thank you to Zimmerly Art Museum for hosting, and thanks so much to each of these incredible panelists for being here. And as Nicole said, in our time of re-articulation of the prison system, in our time of nativism, in our time of Trump, kind of like politics, your work on aesthetics and resistance and documentation is so crucial. And so we're all really excited to hear and see what you have to say. I'm gonna be kind of disciplinary about time, but not punishing about time as an abolitionist. Be gentle. What I'll do is, Brendan Wattenberg is our first speaker, so perhaps each speaker will speak for 10 to maybe 12 minutes, and I'll be able to tell you, I'll signal for 5 and then signal for 1. What I'll do is I'll introduce each of the speakers before you come up. First, Brendan Wattenberg is the managing editor of Aperture magazine, formerly director of exhibitions at the Walther Collection. He's contributed essays and interviews to Another Africa, Contemporary, and Objectif, and Aperture's photo book review, and is the editor of the photo books of Francois Xavier Gebray, The Past is a Foreign Country, and Samuel Fosso, The Spectacle of the Body. Wattenberg holds a BA in English from Haverford College and an MA in Africana Studies from NYU. He's served on the jury for the Addis Photo Festival in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, in 2016. Also on juries for exhibits and panels in China and in Tel Aviv. And so we're lucky to have you. So why don't you start us off? Thank you.
Just waiting for the images to appear. Well, while we do, I first wanted to say thank you for having us here this evening. I'm Brendan. I want to say thanks to Nicole Fleetwood, who brought a incredible vision and commitment to this project. We started speaking with Nicole last summer, and this issue kind of came together last fall, and Nicole is an incredible contributor who brought so many different perspectives, expertise, aesthetic vision, and political commitment to this project. Everyone at Aperture is so proud of the way it turned out. This is the issue itself, with the cover by Sable Smith, who's here with us tonight, and we'll talk a little bit more about her work. Most prisons and jails in the United States do not allow prisoners to have access to cameras. How can images then tell the story of mass incarceration when the imprisoned don't have control over their representation? How can photographs visualize a reality that for many remains outside of view? Those are the questions set forth in the editorial for Prison Nation by Nicole, by Michael Famighetti, and by myself when we were framing this project. Prison Nation follows upon recent issues of Aperture that consider the intersections between photography and social issues and identity politics, including Vision and Justice, which was guest edited by Sarah Lewis, On Feminism, American Destiny, and Future Gender, which considers trans lives in photography, and that was guest edited by Zachary Drucker. Thanks to a grant from the Ford Foundation earlier this year, we presented an exhibition version of Prison Nation at the Aperture Gallery in New York, which was on view in February and March, and was complemented by an incredible series of 6 weeks of public programming, panel discussions, and public engagement with artists, activists, writers, filmmakers, and stakeholders in the pressing question of incarceration in this country. And it was an incredibly moving and mind-expanding series of events. So I'll say thanks to Nicole again for her contributions in bringing so many different voices to Aperture who really were compelling and engaged with this topic in such an interesting way. So these are some installation views of the exhibition at Aperture, and this exhibition will now be touring around the country. So I just wanted to kind of start today's program with a windshield tour of the Prison Nation issue, which, as Nicole said, is available for sale upstairs afterward, and just kind of give you a few highlights of the different writings and images that come together for this issue. So the issue starts out with an expansive conversation between Sarah Lewis and Bryan Stevenson, who just this month, for those of you who don't know, Bryan is a legendary lawyer and activist around death row and prison reform, particularly in Alabama. and is opening through the Equal Justice Initiative a monument to lynching this month. In fact, today might even be the opening day, if I have the date. Is that right, Nicole? It's this, yeah, it's happening. So, and he's an incredible voice for those who often do not have voices. And what's interesting about Bryan is that he has often used photography in the literature for the Equal Justice Initiative's materials in various different ways. And as Sarah Lewis is a historian of photography, brought a very interesting point of view about the question of citizenship in images. So we sent the young photographer John Edmonds to Montgomery to make a portrait of Bryan, which you just saw, and these two images from the Equal Justice Initiative's office and programming in Montgomery, which includes these plaques on the streets memorializing the slave trade. And then we also had some historic and contemporary images, including the one on the top right by Chandra McCormick and Keith Calhoun, who've been documenting, well, basically their life's work has been documenting the effects of mass incarceration in the American South and Louisiana and comparing it to slavery. They were part of the exhibition at Aperture and made a very important contribution to this project in numerous ways. The issue looks back in time through a number of different projects. One of the most fascinating is one by Bruce Jackson, who is an ethnographer and a folklorist, and who in the 1960s and 70s studied prisons in Texas and Arkansas. He was known for helping Danny Lyon get into some of the prisons that he then photographed and made famous, and Danny Lyon is arguably the more famous photographer of the two. But Bruce, who often took audio recordings of work songs and kind of made a portrait of prison life through every detail of every detail, not just through images. His photographs are now becoming more well-known. They were previously published in sort of academic presses. Aperture was the first treatment of his photographs as photographs per se. These are some of Bruce's works, and the American curator and writer Bryan Wallace wrote about Bruce's work for Aperture in an incredibly beautiful and powerful essay, and he says, "These stark black and white photographs capture the primitive social conditions and enforced slave-like labor of a not-so-distant version of criminal justice." So we thought it was important to start this issue again with an archive of little-known photographs that remain extremely compelling today. Another archive comes from Jack Luder's booth, who taught photography at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Framingham in the late 1970s and early 1980s. He collaborated, this is one of the oldest institutions for women, and women and girls are among the fastest growing population in the US in prison and jail, so it remains an incredibly important and relevant topic today. Jack collaborated with women. He taught them how to make photographs and photograms, and then he made portraits of the women himself, really beautiful Polaroid contact prints, which we showed in our exhibition at Aperture. And what's so poignant and beautiful about these images is that the women wore, at that point, they didn't have to wear uniforms, at least in this scenario, and they posed and dressed themselves as they wanted to be seen, and they're not exploitive pictures. They don't rely on any of the cliches of typical prison photography, and they show a sense of trust and communication between the photographer. It was very special for us to publish these for the first time. They were not that well known, and they kind of bring a feminine perspective and the question of teaching and photographic pedagogy, actually, in the space of the prison in an important manner. We have the work of Lucas Folia, who photographed Rikers, where there's a greenhouse program where prisoners participate in horticulture, and he originally photographed this for National Geographic, I believe, and we were glad to publish it here in context of Aperture. We included a conversation between Jamel Shabazz and Lorenzo Steele Jr., who both worked at Rikers in the 80s and the 90s, respectively, as guards. And this conversation was moderated by Jamel's wife, Zarina, who herself worked in the Department of Correction for 2 decades, and so she knew just the right questions to ask. Some of you may know Jamel Shabazz's work from back in the days in a time before crack, his fabulous images of New York in the 80s with all their fashions and self-possession, and his kind of lifelong idea about dignity and honor in African-American life in New York, specifically in the U.S. at large. But during that time, he was also bringing his camera into Rikers and making photographs of guards, of imprisoned men, and trying to portray them with a sense of humanity. And there's a very poignant moment when in his interview, when he speaks about his great desire to help people. I mean, Jamel Shabazz, in addition to being a good photographer, is also someone who has extreme empathy for the people he meets and works with in his life. And he said something that just stuck with me when we were working on the transcript of this, that he would bring some cologne in, that so that some of the prisoners that he was working with would have a smell of something that they might recognize from home. And I think you forget, we were talking a lot in this project about the question of time and how time is very different on the inside, and it hadn't occurred to me about smells and other associations like that, and I found that comment and that detail from Jamel so incredibly powerful. And we also had a number of portfolios by artists, so this included Deborah Lester's exquisite photographs of actors in a performance of the Passion Play at Angola. Most of the imprisoned at Angola are sentenced to life terms, not all, but most. And so the question of the passion, the question of religion, and the question of spirituality is one that is incredibly pressing and existential. And Deborah has been working on questions of crime and punishment throughout her career. She's a photographer who's based in New Orleans and has a long-standing relationship with Angola prison. These are her works. And Nicole Fleetwood, in, I have to say, one of the most beautiful and moving essays Aperture has published in recent times, Nicole wrote about vernacular photography and portraits that are made in prisons and shared with families. Nicole notes in her piece, in terms of sheer volume, prison photography is one of the largest practices of vernacular photography in the contemporary era, although people who don't have a family member or a friend in prison might not even know that such photographs exist. But Nicole considers the conventions of portraits, family portraits that are made in prison, going all the way back to 19th century, traditions of the painted landscape and what have you, but also bringing such a personal perspective with her cousins who were pictured in these images and allowing us into their lives in a very generous and studious way. Highly recommend reading this piece. And I'll just go through the last set of portfolios here. One is by Nigel Pore, who many of you may know, and if you don't, I highly recommend it, the podcast Ear Hustle, which is now going into its second season. Nigel Pore is an educator in the San Quentin prison, and she came across an archive of 4x5 negatives that were taken in the 1980s of life in the prison, and they were organized into various different categories, some of them absurd, some of them enigmatic. And she printed them herself and brought them out, and we published them for the first time, and they're an incredible representation of life in San Quentin at this time. This goes up till about 1988, but they're also extraordinarily well-made photographs, and whoever was using a 4x5 camera and with this negatives, I mean, this was, we don't know who the photographer was or who they were, if there were more than one, and this gives us a sort of sense of that landscape beyond the exotic, beyond the, as I said, the typical cliches. We had a piece by Pete Brook, who has a website called Prison Photography. He's an activist and a kind of curator, and bringing together images, again, that dispel our assumptions about what life looks like inside prison. Jesse will speak more about his work tonight, as will Sable. They are both artists working not necessarily in a documentary way, but in a way that opens us up to aesthetic and conceptual and other modes of thinking about life, incarcerated life, and they have made essential contributions to this issue. So we look forward to hearing more from them this evening, as we do from Mr. Rodriguez, who's going to be talking about his work in Los Angeles and the issues of re-entry. Finally, we had a piece by Zora Murph, who worked in the Iowa correctional system, specifically with juveniles and youth who can't have their faces represented. So he had to find an artful way of representing their stories without portraying the specifics of their identity. I think he's done so with great sensitivity and care and urgency. This is his work. And the issue ends on a kind of reverse establishing shot with the work of Steven Torrentes, who since 1996 has been photographing the prison industrial complex as it is in the built environment in small towns and small cities in the US, and the ambient light, which is both literal and metaphorical. Many of these towns, their economy relies solely on prison labor, the people who live and work there, who work inside the prisons in different ways. And this type of photography goes all the way back to the invention of the medium, the sublime American landscape. But in this case, it's quite terrifying. And Mabel Wilson, who wrote about this, says, Torrentes' luminous prison photographs convey the haunting beauty of everyday places and the terrifying truth of what those landscapes hold. So empathy and political awareness are essential to creating systemic change, and the images in Prison Nation, we hope, may provoke us to see part of ourselves in the lives of those on the inside. So thanks again to Nicole, and thank you, Joe, Jesse, and Sable for your incredibly important contributions to this issue, and thanks for the opportunity to be here this evening.
Next up, we'll have Joe Rodriguez, who is a documentary photographer born and raised in Brooklyn. He teaches in the Photo and Imaging Department at NYU Tisch School of the Arts and the International Center of Photography, ICP. He studied photography in the School of Visual Arts and in photojournalism and documentary photography program at ICP. He's worked at print and online news organizations, including National Geographic, the New York Times Magazine, and the BBC. He's been awarded Pictures of the Year by the National Press Photographers Association and the University of Missouri in 1990, 1992, 1996, and 2002. He's also the author of 7 books, including Spanish Harlem, El Barrio in the 80s, and his photographs have been exhibited worldwide. So we're happy to have you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. Just a little brief about the photographer. Photography, I don't know. I was just in California recently doing a story for the New York Times on reentry in Stockton, California. So I was talking and interviewing several lifers. And so my work kind of stems back from when I was a child for me. My stepfather was in and out of prison, and then I had the wonderful opportunity to go to Rikers Island a couple of times to follow in his footsteps. But photography, again, and this is what I love about Aperture, they understand how therapeutic photography can be. So it actually saved my life. A lot of my friends are not here because of the criminal lifestyle we tended to sort of pursue. So there's a long arc with the work. I understand we're on the clock, so we'll just breeze you through a few images in a minute, but criminal justice I've been covering since, I don't know, the beginning of my career. And why the work in California is being shown tonight is more of a trilogy for me in terms of projects. I began working in the 90s after the riots in 1992 with gangs in Los Angeles, and that project is still ongoing 25 years later. The archive just builds and builds, following people. I like to follow people in a very slow way and see where their lives sort of wind up. So this is kind of the end of the trilogy. First it was East Side Stories, Gang Life in East LA, then it was looking at juvenile justice in Northern California. Now we're looking at Northern California and Southern California. Now what I believe prison work is important is more outside. When you come out, you basically are left with your $250. I think many of you know this narrative, but really struggling with, you know, how do you make it happen? I mean, if you don't have a family or some kind of support network, you're really going to wind up like a lot of these guys. So this man had did like 15 years of prison time, and so he was out on the streets in Stockton and falling back into addiction. Same with this man who actually just recently passed away. I spent a lot of time working with Jesse De La Cruz, who's a man who's done 26 years of time and has a doctorate in education now. He's become a gang expert. So him and I would go out on the street almost like I would work with a journalist in Stockton. So he knew a lot of these guys because he was frequenting and spending a lot of time with them when he was younger. So question to this man would be, you know, what do you have? What do you have? What are you looking forward to? He's on methadone and doesn't have any support network. He's out on the street. So I felt this is Jesse De La Cruz talking to a couple of veteranos, older men. They've all been to prison. A lot of these men have. And so Jesse kind of turned it around. And a couple of his friends are trying to do the same, and there's an engagement of close friendship, but also sincerity and sort of a 12-step philosophy on how to turn people's lives around. Some people make it, we have this saying in being an ex-addict myself, we have this saying that only 1 out of 100 people make it. And it's still a fact now. If you don't have that support network, like this young man came, not young, but did over about 20 years in and out of different systems. And I can't really get too engaged. I want to try to keep the conversations open more than the pictures. Pictures you can find online, pictures you can find of mine in the issue. I spent a lot of time working with Walden House. Walden House was a nonprofit group working inside the prisons in California, because that's where reentry starts, right? Teaching people how to be able to sort of articulate and create a voice for themselves and sort of deal with the pain and suffering that they've been through. These are mothers for the most part, and they've just kind of pretty much been there about a month. And what they do in this women's program is start to get to the core of motherhood. So you abandon your children, what does that feel like? So they have to write these essays, and they're really, I mean, this is where the tears come, but this is also where all of the sort of trauma and fear such this begin to be released. So spent, I would say, about 4 months working with, I would say they did about 30 portraits and 30 interviews. Went on to make some multimedias as well. This woman got caught up with a case on methamphetamine. Her and her husband were cooking it up in the house, and the kids were taken away, and she wound up in prison, but at Walden House, which I think is great. So when I talk to these women, they've carried their numbers for 15, 20 years. So it's a long arc, and when you come out on the street, it just sort of still continues. Getting their children back, learning how to be a mom, big challenges. And the reason why I was able to sort of be so intimate with these women is because this was my mother. My mom dealt with my brother and sister and myself the same way. You know, she wasn't an addict, but my stepfather was, and a criminal. Methamphetamine, I think we're all aware of sort of the drug problems in our country now. Now it's sort of being put on the back burner because we have all this opioid crisis. But, you know, really trying to get your children back is a monster, a real difficult thing to do once you've been in the system. And so this is the first time she's with her son in so many years. So quiet moment with her child. As I mentioned, Walden House works with women and trying to sort of get to this cathartic space of what the trauma has been. They take women to the ocean, and many of the women have never really been to the ocean, been to the beach, and so they leave them alone to write and think for hours at a time of what their journey has been. And then they come back and then they share those essays with the group. But here, a mother's sort of breaking down. She had just seen we went to a park where there were just two swings, children's swings, and there were no children there, but they were moving back and forth. And she just fell apart and just sort of started to talk about and share her pain. Then I went to the men's facility, which is quite intense. This is Master P. I don't know if you guys know who Master P is, but he was a rapper down in New Orleans. This was his dad. And although they haven't seen each other for 15, 16 years, went on to say that he actually went on and got a good job. He had himself a job, so we were following his story as well. When you get locked up, I think that many of you know that you've seen the sort of tattoos on people's bodies and faces and such. Well, if you don't become affiliated with some group in prison, you're really going to have a hard way to go. So we can ask this question later, but 2-3 stands for the 23rd letter of the alphabet, which is W. And this man was a gun runner, and him and his wife and his friend were in a car, an ATF, LAPD, just basically stopped the van and just fired upon them. He was hit with bullets all over his body. His wife was shot and killed, and so was his gun-running partner. He's blind, and his other ex-inmate is helping him. And this is Chris and Pepper. I'm glad we're going to be talking about the issues of gender inside prison and outside prison. It's something that, I was aware of when I was 17 years old inside the system. Where do you fit in? How do you keep yourself safe? All kinds of things. I mean, it's horrific. And for someone who's actually raped in prison, I know what they feel. I know what happens. I don't want to shock everybody in the room, but when you're a youngster and you come in and you're not aware of what happens in there, I was sold for a carton of cigarettes to another prisoner. Yeah. So there was a lot of time spent with Chris and Pepper in a very intimate way. There were things that were said that are not going to be published, but the feelings of me just being there was very important for them. Yeah. First day out, this is his way of feeling the sun. Yeah. And as the men they just keep funneling out. And now in California, there's this big initiative to sort of, the governor has sort of felt guilty about locking everybody up about 30 years ago when he was governor back then. And then so now we're letting a lot of lifers out, but letting them out to what? So, here's their first or second day there. And, this man is basically holding a workshop to try to talk about their responsibilities and whether or not they want it to change. Darlene Escalante is the woman all the way on the right-hand side there. She was at Walden House. She had a home visit for a Christmas holiday, and this was the first time that her brother and her cousin, the two gentlemen on the top left-hand side were just out of prison. So she was out of prison, they were out of prison at the same time, and her mother, who's the matriarch in the middle is a grandmother who passed away. The woman next to her left is her mother. So there was this constant, and all the other women that are there, the older women, all have husbands in prison. So this is kind of the common story in East LA. They're all gang affiliated and gone on from one generation to the next. Yeah, here her mother is in the kitchen talking to her grandchildren and telling her story about what it felt like to see her daughter locked up in the same prison as her. It's a story of a man who, when I met him, was at Walden House and completely tatted up, as you can see here. Yeah, and what these tattoos represent for him is, besides being La Puente, which is his gang, it's also a huge narrative on his body, which it was the only thing that he could control. So I go back to this because this is the way he is now. He's working for Homeboy Industries, which is Father Greg Boyle in Los Angeles, and it's probably the only place that I know that you can be a gang member with full of tattoos and get yourself a job. He works in the bakery. When I just saw him this past summer, I'll be photographing him again because half of his face the tattoos have been taken off. It's a very painful process, takes a long time, but you know, he was very positive and hopeful for his future. So those are my images. We're open for questions, and we'll, I guess, talk about that after, right? Is that right? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And next we'll hear from Sable Lee Smith, who is an interdisciplinary artist, writer, educator based in New York. Her practice considers memory and trauma while enacting an undoing of language. Her work has been featured at the Museum of Modern Art, MoMA PS1, the New Museum, Studio Museum, Signal Gallery, Recess Assembly, Yerba Buena Center for Arts and Artist Television Access in San Francisco, also at the Serpentine Galleries in London. Her writing has been published in Radical Teacher, Studio Magazine, Affidavit, and she recently published her first book. Smith has received awards from Creative Capital, Fine Arts Work Center, the Queens Museum, Rima Hort Mann Foundation, the Franklin Furnace Fund, and Art Matters, and she's currently part-time faculty at Columbia University School of the Arts, visiting faculty at Virginia Commonwealth University in the Sculpture and Extended Media Department. So, thank you.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is basically sort of introduce the kind of framework of my overall practice and click through some images, so not necessarily explain or talk about them. And then I think, hopefully, I assume a lot of questions will sort of come up. As maybe a preface, I have a visual sort of arts practice, a writing practice, and I'm an educator in a number of sort of places as far as arts education is concerned, but I also work in and sort of have relationships with a number of diversion programs and creating curriculum and pedagogy for a number of sort of organizations that interact with the criminal justice system in a number of kind of like sections or levels. Okay, the clicker. Beautiful. Okay, so to start, my work examines the sort of complex language and emotional landscapes embedded in systems of surveillance and structures of constraint, and the often invisible ways in which they shape our minds or direct our bodies. Typically, I sort of use video for sculpture, photography, and text, amongst other things, to point to the carceral, the personal, the political, and the quotidian, to speak about a violence that is sort of largely unseen and potentially imperceptible. Much of the practice is derived from the intersection of cinema, language, particularly the written text, and image making, construction, deconstruction, and abstraction. So me, I'm super interested in the potential of language as object, folding itself around itself, its desire for accuracy, and its potential undoing. At the core of my practice is a desire to understand in many ways that trauma and violence is sort of graphed and marked across bodies, but also the language we use and construct to articulate that. and the things that are sort of pictured just beyond the frame. So to do this, we must look at the trickery of memory, the poetry embedded in the fictions we create for ourselves, the fictions of our desires, the fictions of the systems and structures governing our lives. So how do we know what we're looking at? I often like to say I work from the archive of my own body to create a syntax for knowing and not knowing, thereby marking the difference between witnessing and watching. And I think about this a lot because these are sort of two very distinct subject positions. Think of the one who bears witness and the one who watches to consume. And obviously, I think there's some sort of slipperiness between the two, but I'm really interested in the moments that those sort of straddle the line or sort of slip in and out of each other. Between looking and being looked at, spectacle and spectatorship, enjoyment and being enjoyed, lives and moves the economy of what Saidiya Hartman calls hypervisibility. So my sort of current body of work is focused on mass incarceration, but it doesn't live there solely, and it's sort of deeper than the kind of like surface buzzword that we might think of or that's sort of proliferating our kind of like contemporary landscape right now when we think about mass incarceration. So as a part of the kind of research or shadow archive that informs the work, I'm using these sort of aerial views of prison complexes as a point of reference, as well as the architectural materials and markings of their interiors. I extract colors, blues in particular. There we go. The clicker doesn't want to work no more. Demarcation lines, and other fragments that sort of touch on the experience of visiting my father in various prisons over the past sort of, I guess, 21 years now. So I've been visiting prisons since I was 10 years old. And so for me, the subsequent works begin to sort of examine and dismantle the regulatory codes that are both embedded in the body yet deeply impersonal. And again, these are the aerial views that you'll see are all California state prisons that I've been in, and obviously by default my father. But yeah, so I'm looking at this quotidian violence again. So these sort of invisible interactions and transgressions of the day-to-day. And I'm more concerned in my work, in my sort of practice, at least with their profound impact over time, more so than the catastrophic. I'm trying to sort of look at and hone in on the terror that can hardly be discerned. So when I'm thinking about violence, I'm not thinking about capital V violence, right? Or the thing that the picture that sort of immediately sort of surface, right, to the forefront of the brain. I'm really interested in the experience of sort of me walking through the threshold of the prison in my body, creating or sort of taking on this subconscious sense of correction, right? Because the architecture is sort of impressed upon my body, right? And what does that do over time? And when does one recognize it, for example? Or as Fred Moten has articulated it, and this is probably one of my favorite quotes that I'm always going back to, at issue here is the precariousness of empathy and the uncertain line between witness and spectator. Only more obscene than the brutality unleashed at the whipping post is the demand that this suffering be materialized in evidence by the display of the tortured body or the endless recitations of the ghastly and terrible. In light of this, how does one give expression to these outrages without exasperating the indifference to suffering that is the consequence of the bemoaning spectacle, or contend with the narcissistic identification that obliterates the other, or the prurience that too often is the response to such displays? So how do we picture violence? And even more specifically, how do we sort of picture or talk about or create language around carceral violence? My formal attention is really sort of rooted in a poetic and fragmentation, a repetition that's about dissolution, collage, the landscape of memory, and a tension between narrative and non-narrative. The video work, of course, has a relationship to experimental cinema, but also an engagement with the cinematic syntax. So my practice, specifically the visual practice, is invested in a boundary dissolution, in a sort of seamless shift from position to position, context to context, frame to frame, and all the sort of messy, complicated shit in between. This is the sort of residue of the things that I'm working with. But for the Aperture issue, they excerpted a couple of pages from this artist book that I recently made, which is this image here, and there was a couple of other images through the slideshow. It's titled Landscapes and Playgrounds. So the images which peppered the book under the sort of loose categories that the nouns of its title suggests all come from a carceral space. And collapsed on top of these are facsimiles of letters that my father has sent to me. So the intimacy of the letter sort of points to an interior space, but also a silent sort of control slips to the surface in the banality of my father requesting that I fill out yet another visiting form because I've been misgendered yet again on this sort of municipal document. So the book turns a sort of intimate eye on the interior, the body, and the layered relationship between parent and child, individual and state, object and institution. Thank you.
Our final presenter is Jesse Crimes, who is a conceptual artist who lives and works in Philadelphia. While serving a 6-year prison sentence, he produced numerous bodies of work that have been exhibited in Paris, the Zimmerli Art Museum here, at Rutgers, the Leonard Pearlstein Gallery at Drexel, among other venues. And after his release in 2014, he partnered with the Sozi Agency to co-found the Right of Return USA, which is the first national fellowship dedicated to supporting formerly incarcerated artists. And he's currently a 2017 Robert Rauschenberg Fellow and is represented by Burning and Water Gallery in New York. So we're happy to have him.
Hi, everyone. So this is my second time back here. It was, in 2015, I was first here for the Prison Arts and Activism Conference that Nicole organized, and my work was shown here. This is the first place that I had a solo show. So I'm incredibly grateful to be back, and thank you, Donna and Nicole, for inviting me back for this. And so a lot of my work explores, it's developed through like a very autobiographical lens, right? And so it explores kind of my personal experience entering into the prison system and some of the things that I produced while I was there as a way to kind of highlight things that in many ways I was completely unaware of, right? So just to give everyone some context for some of my work, I was indicted shortly after I graduated from school, and I ended up going into the jail. They charged me with 140 grams of cocaine. I refused to cooperate. They ended up charging me with 50 kilos of cocaine, which never existed. And then on top of that, they also placed me in solitary confinement, which is where I began to use artwork really as a way to survive, as a way to kind of resist all of these kind of institutional pressures that were being applied to me to get me to cooperate, but also to get me to conform to this idea that somehow I'm different, right? And that's what the prison system is really designed to do. It's designed to kind of grind you into this resentfulness and hopelessness to the point where you feel like your life doesn't matter, right? And so one of the ways that, the main way that I worked against that was to create artwork. And so a lot of my art deals specifically with materials and using the kind of latent language that is in materials as a way to kind of comment on the system, but also society in a much broader sense. And so a lot of the images that you see here, these are image transfers out of newspapers onto the surface of prison-issued soap. And so for me, these soaps had all of the connotations of what the penitentiary is in essence designed to do, right? This idea of purification, of sanitization, which is not what the prison does, but it's also, it's kind of like this false idea that we think that people go into prison and they need to be fixed, they need to be rehabilitated, when oftentimes there are a lot of traumas that people are working through, but everyone that's in prison is the same as everyone sitting in this room. And so I really, wanted to kind of complicate how people understand individuals who end up going into prison, right? It's not these kind of cliched notions that you see on TV or see when you read a newspaper about someone who committed a crime. And so these are all offender mugshots that I removed from the paper, and by removing them, I remove them from the context of that framing, right? And so you see these individuals just as individuals, and not from that one moment in time, because people are always much more complex than one of their actions. And so, while I was in there and I was creating these soap portraits, I also needed to figure a way to get them out of the system. And because you can't just freely mail contraband materials out of the system, I had to figure out a way transferring the images, the portraits, onto the surface of prison bed sheets, and then recreating these masterwork drawings that were in an art history book that someone passed to me. And so I would just look at the images in the book, draw them by hand, transfer the images of offenders where the religious icons were. And so similar to the same way with the cards, it's kind of an elevating of the offender to that of kings, jacks, and queens of royalty and to religious icons, and the lowering of religious icons to that of the offender. Because at the end of the day, everyone is just a normal person. And so all of these social structures and hierarchies are completely artificial, right? And so kind of reset a little bit. After I was in solitary, still refused to cooperate, I ended up arguing my drug weights in front of the judge. I was found guilty of 500 grams, which is significantly less than the 50 kilos that I was charged with. Right, again, this is ghost dope. These are drugs that were never found. And so for that, I got a 70-month sentence in a federal correction institution. And the judge also recommended that as a nonviolent offender, I should go to a low security facility, and instead they sent me to a maximum security facility where, as Joseph was saying earlier, I walked in there and everything was segregated by race, right? And so artwork and creating artwork was one of the ways that I was able to kind of not click up. It was one of the ways that I could bypass all of those racial divisions and form friendships, because you're still allowed to do business across race. You just can't have friends across race. And so making artwork not only was a way to remain independent and not have to join a gang while I was in there, but it was also a way to get to know people on a much deeper level. And so this is one of the pieces that I began working on while I was there. And these are all image transfers out of the New York Times using hair gel and a plastic spoon. And I would come back through after transferring the image and blend them together with colored pencil to create these kind of surrealist landscapes. And so over time, again, I work in repetition. This turned into Apocalyptine, which is 39 prison bed sheets. It measures 15 feet by 40 feet. And again, this is something that took me 3 years to make. And so this is from 2010 to 2013. There are thousands of images on this. And being in prison, one of the only ways, particularly thinking about photography, it's one of the only ways that you're able to experience the outside world, right? And so without seeing these images in the newspaper, all you're left with are cement and walls, right? And so seeing these images while being removed from society, also allowed me to kind of understand society in a much better way. Like, it allowed me to see a lot of the imagery that is kind of broadcast through these mediated outlets and how they really form damaging social norms and how we decide who's valuable and what we see as valuable. And so again, thinking about the transfer process, it's inversing those images. And so a lot of what you see here, it's basically a snapshot of the world, but an inverse. And so when I came home, I recreated this piece and installed it at Eastern State Penitentiary. It's the first penitentiary in the world. It's also the origin of solitary confinement. And so this piece specifically is playing off of the architecture of the prison, the eye of God, the kind of religious overtones that go into these ideas of rehabilitation and repentance. It's a detail image. And so since I've come home, you know, I've been doing a lot of like museum shows and gallery shows, and I've been kind of preaching to the choir a lot. And so I've really been trying to push myself to create artwork that is in the public space, that is confronting individuals who aren't going to come to the Zimmerli Museum to hear people talk about something like this. And so I'm really trying to figure out ways to go out into the community and meet people where they're at and talk to people about issues of incarceration. And so if you understand that 1 in 3 Americans has a criminal record, that is a pretty significant number. And so even communities that say that they don't have any connection to incarceration, that's a lie. And so in a lot of communities, it's hard to have those conversations because of the stigma and everything that surrounds it. And so I'm trying to create monuments like this. This is for the Close Rikers Project. But I'm also going into the community where I'm from, out in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and trying to work with some of the religious organizations, raise a barn in the center of a corn maze, get some country singers to come out, right, and like create the space for people to be able to have these conversations, but also like, you know, subtly dive into what mass incarceration really is and its racial impact, right? But it's figuring out ways to kind of message test and like get these audiences engaged in a way that feels safe for them to engage. And so I use a lot of my artwork now as a way to kind of go back into communities that would never even consider visiting an art venue. These are some detail images. So again, these are image transfers on ceramic tiles that are painted over. And then the idea is that people who are directly impacted from Rikers can come up, make a slash mark on the tile, and peel away the paint. And it reveals this kind of underlying trauma that is often ignored. And it's really trying to confront people in a public space. And even in the process of trying to make this, like no one in New York City will touch this because it's not safe, right? It's not comfortable. But I mean, comfortability is complicity. And so like we need to wake people up to what's happening because this is a really serious issue and it's happening all over the country in every single community. And this is something that I'm beginning to work on now. This is like a detail image, but I'm basically going through Google's algorithms and I'm sourcing various generalized search terms and doing image searches and related image searches. And I'm kind of compiling this large archive of imagery that depicts social norms as it is reflected through clicks, right? So Google's algorithms only reflect what social values are. And so this is kind of almost like Apocalyptine, but doing it through a kind of new media format and archiving it and exposing it in a way that is sometimes easier to understand than when people just come up and say something to you or talk about statistics and numbers. And so with that, I think that's everything I have. And I'd be happy to answer questions during the panel.
So, thanks, everyone. We have about 15 minutes, so, and, you know, you all gave really rich, really different and also overlapping presentations, so I was thinking maybe the audience would like an opportunity to ask questions, so we could just open it to the audience and see what happens. Yeah, in the back. Mm-hmm.
My name is Bryan. I work for New Jersey Ranch Corporation, actually, with colleagues today. I'm sure Peters. I work for New Jersey Reentry Corporation. I know that we just spoke about reentry. I visited London. I stayed in London for a while. They have the Koestler Awards, or the Koestler Trust, which is like they embrace and encourage offenders or returning citizens, anybody, detainees, to do art, to submit art, and then they'll, if they would like, they'll sell it, and the offender will make 50% of the profit. 25% will go to a victim's fund, and then another 25% will go to the victim. Why is it considered contraband here and embraced there? Like, and do you feel that it would be? Do you feel that our recidivism rate would be reduced here if we did that? Anybody?
I mean, I think one of the things is it depends on the materials they're using. So the reason that the works that I was creating were considered contraband is because I was stealing the prison sheets, defacing them, which is destruction of prison property, and I was also taking their soap. I say stealing, but it's more appropriating, because in prison, everyone who's in there is making those things. And so it's using basically slave labor to produce all of these products, which, you know, the BOP has major factories. They make over close to $800 million a year doing this, and only 6% of that goes towards salaries for people in prison. And so anyway, I think if you use approved materials, then it's not that big of an issue. But to answer your second point, I do think that having more arts programming has the potential, I mean, I don't know if it's directly correlated to lowering recidivism, but it has the potential for people to express themselves in a healthy way, which is extremely important when you're in a situation like that, where when you can't express yourself, when you feel like you have no one that you can really trust or talk to, you know, it gives you that outlet to release something that may get released in a more damaging way. So if I didn't have artwork, I'm not too afraid to say this. I feel like I would have been lashing out at a lot more, particularly with staff. So.
I think there was a question in the front. Mm-hmm.
You know, cameras are not allowed in prisons, and the kind of paradox between what I think Joe talked about, the therapeutic value of photography versus the evidentiary power of photography to, you know, maybe show things that prisons don't want to be seen, and if that is the reason that maybe a camera wouldn't be permissible as a medium for what you're talking about in terms of self-expression for prisoners themselves. And so if maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
In my experience, I saw more juvenile facilities in California working with youth with a camera. You know, there's more flexibility there, but when you get into the state prison system or even the federal prison system, I mean, even just getting paper and ink has become a huge, big issue. So, I mean, I have to stem it back to from where I just came from. I came from Vacaville Prison just a couple of weeks ago, and there's this new program that these lifers have started called Sar Self-Awareness and Recovery. Now, most of us think about that as sort of the 12-step program, but they're stemming back and working with with murderers, these guys really took people's lives away, but it was just profound to hear the stories of when they were 4, when they were 5. And through their oral presentations and their writings, that's become very therapeutic. There's also another program I work with called The Beat Within, which was a juvenile program with writing and drawing, but still the camera becomes a tricky thing. For some reason, we can get those cell phones in there, but we just can't seem to get those cameras in there.
Correctional officers bring cell phones in.
But it's changed over time. I mean, I think one of the reasons why we wanted to publish Bruce Jackson and Jack Ludersbooth's images is because they're very rare now. And Nicole, maybe you could actually clarify for this, but I seem to remember when we were working on this issue that after 9/11, the regulations about cameras in prison changed, and that's why there are fewer images of the type that we see from Jack or from Bruce today. Is that?
So since September 11, all prisons and quote correctional facilities have become more securitized, and they're also become less and less transparent. We have more and more black sites, and those black sites are basically prisons that are off the landscape. We can't find them. We don't know where they are, and some of them are in cities. There's a black site detention center in New Jersey near the airport where people are being held, and we don't have record of who's even being held in those facilities. So it's allowed for just a gross level of abuses in terms of, in quote, defense to security.
Come on, folks. I know you got a question or two.
Are you all ready for wine and magazines?
We had a lot of conversations about the title. We wanted to have a title that would signify that we're talking about this country, even if we didn't say the United States. And I think probably for American readers of the issue, you'd have a sense that that's what we were talking about. But we also wanted to talk, I guess we wanted to have a play on words about nation, citizenship, and a term that comes up frequently, like the archipelago of mass incarceration, like the idea that it's not just one prison, but it's actually a nation of prisons, or a nation that is being defined by prison. Would you agree with that, Nicole?
For more of like a general parlance, but we wanted to have something that also really encompasses the work of, like Joe Rodriguez said, sector prisons, but people are still suffering.
I mean, I just want to share this notion of parole. That is the biggest nightmare besides what you see on the screen, what these artists have done. That is in my view, and many of these people that I've been interviewing now for the past 20 years, parole is the ultimate shackles, really.
Maybe if there's, yeah.
I don't know, maybe it's because I'm so obsessed with music, but you got to work with Master P's father. What was it like talking to somebody whose son is so affluent, so successful, and I don't know if they shared in that relationship together and the success, but what was it like working with him, at least?
Well, he just put in a lot of work, as we say on the street, meaning he put a lot of people to sleep so permanently, and I think at this point when I met him, we were just around the time when our President Barack Obama was coming into his presidency, and he was very enamored by that sort of unprecedented sort of journey. When we talked about his son, he was estranged from him, and his son was estranged from him. Although I also photographed Master P for the Source magazine. I hung out with him for 3 or 4 days prior to meeting his father. So at some point, I think I will send a photograph to Master P. But the typical issues of like abandonment, to many things that happened to us in many of the hoods in the country. You know, I wasn't there as a father. I feel guilty. That's one thing, dealing with a lot of lifers, you start to see, and mothers as well, you know, this redemptive sort of idea that's in their head of what they were not there for, what they didn't do, you know, and trying to reconnect with family, so.
Can I ask a question? I have a question for you, Sable. How did you find a way to make art that engaged your personal and social experience with incarceration, but that was indirect and conceptual, and you're working in media? How did you find your way of expressing those ideas?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, especially thinking about like the context in which we are navigating different types of contexts, right? And like how the work gets framed in an academic institution versus a museum versus a gallery where there's a profit and an economy built around it, right? Like that changes how one has to, or it should change how one has to frame or think about like what to sort of put on view. And so for me, I wouldn't say that the work is indirect.
Or just non-documentary.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the kind of like, the first answer is I wasn't necessarily interested in documentary as a frame and as a like a kind of genre or landscape to participate in, because there are problems in that for me. The thing that was sort of more interesting was to think about a complexity of an experience and also think about humanity and the kind of intersections of one, like how certain images are constructed, right? And so using appropriation to sort of point back to the images that create a kind of like standard narrative for us, and then doing something complicated to that by placing another image next to it or whatever. And so I guess those are just like my sort of interests. And then thinking about poetry, right, and the kind of like uses or power of language in a kind of slower, like latent read that can come to the surface and also linger. I think it in the images it doesn't sort of read as well, but I think a lot of the work, especially the video work that I make, is haunting, and that's a word that people say to me often, and I'm interested in that, and that's sort of important that it stays with you, right, and it has this kind of sting. But I guess maybe potentially the kind of like conceptual frame or like an engagement with abstraction is thinking about the context that the work shows up in, and how to sort of confront the audience, right? So that the work can't be consumed as this kind of like entertainment, right? So it's not just like the image of black pain or black criminality or like the kind of like token image, right? Like it has to have this kind of like bite. And so those inform the decisions that I make based on like what the sort of context is, right? Like I can be sort of more forthcoming and vulnerable and open about something that is sort of an academic, right, institution, or that doesn't have a certain type of economy built around it. And in other spaces, I can't do that and refuse to do that. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
At the back.
Well, thank you everyone for all what you presented. My question is for all of you. Have any of you worked with immigrant populations in prisons, given that, you know, they're really an extension of it, and also how the prison system here in the U.S. has extended to other countries as well? I'm curious if any of you had worked with immigrant populations in prison.
I wouldn't say we get access to prisons, but, you know, I did a project called Migrant Days. I followed migrant families for 6 years, actually, no, longer than that, from 1995 to 2006, so all around the country. But when I was in Nogales, we had the opportunity of working with my friend, a journalist, Ruben Martinez, who we partnered a lot together. And so whilst we were in the holding facility in Nogales, where they just would arrest people and just put you, we found children there as well. So, but, you know, I took pictures. I always get myself in trouble, so I had my guy kind of sort of protecting me as I was snapping, and I would change roles. I mean, it was a strategy that I learned from war photography with Border Patrol. But it was an interesting view of what happens on a daily basis. But in terms of getting access to sort of the ICE facilities, I mean, you'd have to go through some large news organization to be able to see if you can get access through them. So, but many of the folks would get back on the bus, they'd send them back, you know, and there's images of, it's just the children that would just come across the border just to eat. So, you know, this conversation that's happening now in Washington, we've been covering this for 20 years, so this is not anything new for us, but when it affects families as it has been now lately, it's just been really horrific. So we're still trying to fight the fight as much as we can. Yes.
We spent a lot of time contacting immigration attorneys and friends of mine who are doing work around organizing, and most of them can't even get access to the detention centers where they're trying to represent people, let alone get like photographs. So it was, Brenda, when you say it was like really, I mean, we were reaching out across the country, and it was really, really depressing to hear how people who are on the front line have limited access to these spaces and to being able to document the actual conditions of these detention centers.
Maybe we can take one more question?
Yeah.
For any of us that live in the area, the First Reformed Church in Highland Park organizes tours to the ICE facility that I think you mentioned in Elizabeth, and that is a detention center. And you need, it's easier to go with them because they know the names of the detainees. In other words, you can't just show up and say, well, I'd like to visit. They will not let you document or come in with cameras or anything like that. For anybody, though, kind of like inclined to go visit or spare time, the church is the First Reform, and Pastor Seth organizes the, I think today they visit the male detainees, and tomorrow, Wednesday, they visit female detainees. Yeah, just in case, yeah.
Well, can we give a round of applause to all the presenters and to Nicole Fleetwood as well? Thanks so much.